I know that's a hard thing for us to grasp, and it's one of the things that we feel condemned when we hear that. Oh, we're putting ourselves down. No, we're calling on God's grace to lift us up, to recognize who we are, what we've done, and move forward. Paul says, we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, being prepared by God to establish God's building. God says we are all those things. We are the fellow workers, we're God's field, and we are God's building. Now we just sang a hymn to start our worship time. A beautiful reminder and a challenging call to actively engage. Let us build a house where love can dwell and all can safely live. It's interesting how we put words into statements, into hymns, into our conversations. We put these words and we just brush over them. But we need pause on some of those words. Let us build a house where love can dwell and all can safely live. A place where saints and children tell how hearts learn to forgive. So yeah, there's a recognition we'll stumble and fall, but we can still learn to forgive. Built of hopes and dreams and visions, rock of faith and vault of grace. Here the love of Christ shall end divisions. That's what we're aiming at in hearing the Word of God today. That's what Paul was writing to the first early church, to the Corinthians, because they were at each other's throats. They were building factions. They were choosing their favorite leader. And Paul, one of those favorite leaders, said, don't do that to us. Do not put us in that position. We are only servants like you. We have called you to faith in God, but God accomplishes anything and all things that will be accomplished in this world. There are other hymns of the Black spiritual tradition that call our spirit to hold on to God's grace, to give thanks for one another throughout our daily life, and to celebrate our family of God expressed in every race and color. And I think it is a spirit-filled coincidence that Paul's letter to the Corinthians is a very timely word and reflection for us to ponder here in February, the beginning of a year. An opportunity to look into the year where we could make difference, to call forward change, and to enact it so that people will see who we are. Throughout the season of Epiphany, we've heard and affirmed that the Word made flesh is God's own wisdom and power graciously revealed to us in Jesus Christ. Yet often we fail to grasp how profoundly this truth has changed the world. And we still try to make the old non-Epiphany ways work. I'd say non-Epiphany ways. Epiphany is the coming of the light of God, shining into the darkness, breaking apart our hidden and darkened places. So we keep wanting to go back to that. But God says, no, you've given your heart to me. You've been changed. And I'm going to work with you to make that a reality. The Corinthians seem to have been stuck in those ways too. In chapter 1 of the writings of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 10 to 17, Paul has begun talking about how the Corinthians were arguing over allegiances to various apostles. And then before that issue was settled, Paul seemed to forget all about it and to wander off into discussions about the cross of Christ as the wisdom and the power of God. Why did he do that? because he wanted the people to hear again, in light of the challenges that they were having, to hear again that foundational gift of God in Jesus Christ. In the second chapter of that writings, he has mentioned how we, meaning everyone, not just we, Paul, and Paul as the leaders, and not just we, the Corinthian church, but all in the church who have read that over the generations. We, here in Tsawwassen, we share spiritual things with spiritual people. And the Corinthians probably thought that they were included in that claim that Paul was making. Oh, that's a feel-good thing that Paul is saying about us. We're part of that spiritual practice. But Paul begins chapter 3 with the emphatic statement. Paul makes clear that in practice, we aren't spiritual at all. It feels like these letters are pulling us back and forth and making us confused. Paul, what are you saying? Are we in it or are we not? He says, when you come to Christ, once you have received Christ, and once you have been received by Christ, you are Christ's, marked in our baptism with the sign of the cross. It says in our baptism vows we are marked as Christ's forever. But we seem to choose to fall away, to turn back, to go back to old ways, to go back to the familiar things, instead of entrusting ourselves into the new things that God is calling us to. Now, Paul makes clear that they aren't spiritual at all, since their behavior is being determined by competition for status and expected pursuits of society rather than the gospel. Now, we can easily and appropriately add many stumbling blocks that we would name that trip us up: prejudice, arrogance, cultural and racial bias. How readily do the clothes and the look of someone coming down the road in a little bit of a darker part of the evening, and their dark skin causes us to be cautious, just a little bit more attentive to what's going on. How quickly do we stereotype images that conjure in our thoughts until that person has gone past us and we don't have to worry about them anymore? You see, it's built into us. And we choose not to, we want to not to. We want to let go of those prejudices, those images in our thoughts and heart and our spirit, and yet our body reacts. We need to ask God to clear, to release, to open us, to be free, to be at ease, to welcome the one coming toward us. Oh, I know, in our world, we always need to be aware, because there is so much craziness that goes on, and people do choose to invade our space and to violate us. Yes, there is something that we need to be attentive to, but let's not make it about race or bias. Let's make it just about being wise and attentive and aware and ready. Why don't we learn? Just like the Corinthians. Why didn't they learn? Paul was writing to them because they had given their lives to Jesus Christ. They had given their life to the church. They wanted to be people of faith. And yet Paul is coming saying, why are you not doing what you said you wanted to do? Why don't we learn? We all too easily repeat the errors of past generations. So-called political fervor drives us to think our way is superior. So I'll make sure everybody hears me and does it my way so that we can all do my way together. And then I don't have to worry about thinking about other things. It's so crazy, our form of manipulating power. The central message of this passage is that nothing of substance will be produced by our own efforts. It is only God who makes things grow. Plants, the flowers, the gifts of capacity within human beings, the knowledge, the spiritual maturity, all of these are gifts of God, and only God will bring them to fruition as we choose and commit ourselves to follow. So where does that leave us? Well, Paul does say, he does affirm the early Christians and us today in the hearing of this word. Paul says, we are God's fellow workers. God has received us, and God has sent us out to do the work of the Spirit of God. All of us, we don't so much choose. God chooses to move us into being fellow workers of God. Every race, every culture, every heart open for the seed of God to take root in it. We are God's field, the place where God's work will blossom. Within us, when we are open to God's seed to grow, amazing things happen. We are God's building, Paul says. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? That's just a few verses after what we read. Verse 16 of this chapter, the 3rd chapter of Corinthians. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and God's Spirit lives in you? By declaring that God was giving the growth, Paul stresses God's ongoing, continual action in us. The labor of Paul and Apollos would not have been fruitful if God had not been at work in them. This is the bedrock conviction of any ministry, whether that is a ministry carried out by a designated leader, or by the church, or by individual members of the church in their own particular vocations, or by the church as a whole in the world. We can engage in ministry only in the trust that God is going to be at work in and through what we do, to bring the growth that God wants. If the work we are engaged in is built on some other conviction, it isn't really ministry of the gospel. But it is focused somewhere, and we need to choose where our focus will be. So as we hear this word today, I hope and pray that we will gain insight and understanding of our practice of mission, and in all its senses, that we should be shaped not by our culture's assumptions about consumerism and the associated assumptions that mission means looking at the best religious deal on the block. We don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. That's our thinking. That's not God's thinking. Rather than such culturally bound ways of seeing the church's mission and ministry, this text might lead us to imagine what it means that our calling is to plant and see God's mercy, which will grow by God's grace and action in God's time. So even if we do something that is what we understand and trust and believe is planted by God in us to give to others, we can't then say, okay, God, I've done it. Make it happen now. I want to see it now. We can't demand anything of God. All we can do is the planting and the seeding, the inviting, the witness. We can speak that which we have been granted by God, that seed would plant in others. So perhaps we all need a reminder, whether we spend worship time in the pulpit or in the pews, that neither the congregation nor the ministry belongs to us. It is God's ministry through us. The church does not belong to culture or the marketplace, so we don't have to worry about meeting the world's standards. It doesn't even belong to the practical or particular theologians or the particular denominational confessions that we make. The church belongs to God. The church is called to see in and through the workers of the church that God is the one who is bringing growth, maturity, and the full flowering of the seed that has been planted through the preaching and the living of the gospel. There's a lot in those few verses that Paul has written to the Corinthians these many generations ago. And they apply every bit as much to today as they did in that moment when Paul was speaking.